Well, fishing, which at first did not impress, proved to be very successful. On board, there are more than 80 tons of herring. The folds are filled, and now Kalinovka is waiting for its turn to moor to the floating base and unload the catch onto the factory. Of course, I wasn't allowed to real fishing acrobatics, to manipulate with the filled trawler, but instead, I managed to participate in untangling the gear, back up the sailors, and salt my hands in the Sea of Okhotsk. In general, I felt a sense of belonging. But most importantly, I know that here, under several layers of clothing, I have a key. The key is to the warm cabin at the floating base, Vsevolod-Sibirtsev. That is, to such a place which is spacious, cozy, does not swing, where there is heat and wireless internet, and even a sauna. And very soon I will be there. And these guys will continue to work here, and they will work for more than one more month. It took only 3 hours to set up the trawl to its ascent to the deck. During this time, the floating base has already managed to get closer to the fishing ship, and in less than an hour, Kalinovka will take place in the line for the delivery of the catch. The captain has a rare opportunity to sleep. But after 4.5 hours in the darkness, he took his place at the control panel of the thruster propellers and moored to the starboard side of Vsevolod-Sibirtsev. The unloading of raw materials begins. The factory revived again. Herring is sorted and sent to different shops. Bigger fish is for freezing. Smaller fish is for canned food. But regardless of the fish size, it first gets processed. By the way, for a 21st century person, there seems to be a lot of manual work. However, this is the only way to achieve the necessary flexibility of production. Machines take up a lot of free space, and even on such a ship, it is not enough. And it's easier to teach a person than reprogram a machine. There are plenty of people, but people are going to make money without realizing until the end that it will be necessary to make great efforts in the sea before making money. And the efforts are both physical and psychological. The second, it seems, is more important than the first, because you can imagine how, for several hours in raw, you do the same manipulations over and over. But you can't know the state of your mind will change during 9 months, far from your family, from your friends. For that, you've got to have a lot of experience or a really developed imagination. Not everyone will cope. Here, they've got to be ready to come, be assigned to certain tasks, and get started. Of course, a master will teach them how to do that. For example, how to clean or operate a machine. This is necessary, and everything else depends on the person. Vsevolod-Sibirtsev is not just a floating base. Its design is well thought out. Thus, living quarters are located in the bow and stern superstructures. Moreover, cabins can be compared to cozy hotel rooms. In addition to the gym, there is a cinema, saunas, a swimming pool, and even a hospital. The vast majority of ships have medical facilities and doctors. But when there are over 400 people on board, and they are on the same ship for 9 months, the likelihood of someone getting sick is inevitably approaching 100%. Therefore, there is not just a medical unit on Sibirtsev, but an entire onboard clinic. It's not just about the crew. Like mechanical workshops, Vsevolod-Sibirtsev's medical facilities should serve the entire expedition. That is, if the ship's doctor, for example, on the trawler can't cope with the severe trauma, the victim is transported to the shipping base, and thus, sometimes a life is saved. Well, in general, harsh conditions at sea don't have many positive effects on one's health. Permanent living in damp conditions, in cold conditions, is perfect for the development and flaring up of chronic diseases. Is it really so hard to work on the floating base? It's time to check out for myself. Having dressed in the necessary overalls, I'm going to take my place at the conveyor belt. Now, I am a factory worker. You get used to the smell, oddly enough, pretty quickly. But something which is hard to get used to, at least for me, is this noise, which makes you want to run away immediately. Covering your ears with some headphones, for example with classical music. It seems to me that something impressionistic would suit. For example, Stravinsky. But definitely not The Little Mermaid, no. After training, I moved to another site. By the way, changes here are constant. This allows to bring in at least some diversity in this generally very monotonous activity. I would gladly tell you something very exciting about this process. In fact, nothing exciting is here. Although there are lots of tricks and experienced handlers clean the fish, in general, in 2 movements. But if I start doing this, I can easily cut one of my necessary fingers. And secondly, responsibility is a pressure for me, because I'm cleaning fish for the first time, and I understand perfectly that someone will eat the herring cleaned by me, maybe even me. And finally, for all the apparent simplicity of these operations, I personally do not understand how this can be done for 12 hours in a row every day, even if with short breaks. I can hardly imagine what kind of motivation is needed to endure all this for 9 months. I'm starting to understand those who return to shore before the end of the contract. Even though there are, let's say, a gym and the internet, but still, people are in a confined space. By the standards of the fishing fleet, conditions on floating bases are considered to be comfortable, and Vsevolod-Sibirtsev is thought of as the most comfortable of all the ships. Most of the crew here live in double cabins. On all residential decks, there is a Wi-Fi network with internet access. At least here it is simply spacious. But if you can't imagine your life without a personal shower in your private cabin, then you have nothing to do in the fishing fleet. Natalia came to Primoria from Ufa. Since 2011, she's been going to sea, had time to work on short expeditions, and eventually decided on a long one.
I'd say that living conditions in this company aren't bad. I also worked on a mini base, Kapitan Yefremov, also belonging to the same company, in 2011, by the way. It was my first ship. Same conditions, and meals are good.
Kapitan Yefremov is one of those so-called mini-bases built for the project, Kamchatsky's Shelf. These vessels have a length of 126 meters and a displacement of about 9,000 tons. Modest indicators by the standards of Sea of Okhotsk. In total, 6 such bases were built between 1990 and 1995. Before Sea of Okhotsk appeared, it was the small floating bases that were the main marine production complexes of Dobroflot. It was on such floating bases that the business processes and interaction of fish processing ships with fishing ships were worked out. And it was here that the 6-6 schedule was worked out, according to which all those who were engaged in processing the catch in the open seas lived and worked. That is, after a 6-hour shift, the sailor received the same amount of rest time, after which the cycle was repeated. It is not easy to get used to such a schedule. There are such moments sometimes when people foreign to the sea don't get used to the fact that the ship rolls, that it influences the health somehow. They can't get used to that. They become seasick. We have to look for some compromises. In any case, people must adapt themselves to the work of the ship, not the ship to the people. So they get used to the sway. They get used to the sway of life. The mode of operation, which has proved itself at small floating bases, turned out to be unsuitable for a large factory ship that leaves the dock for most of the year.
We, of course, worked all this time, 6 on, 6 off, but many simply couldn't stand it. They resigned. They left.
And it was difficult not only for ordinary factory workers, but also for those who are responsible for organizing the whole process. For example, Yuri Arshinin, the head of the Vsevolod-Sibirtsev production, does not consider the 6-6 schedule as universal. I think that 6-6 is ineffective. 12-12 here is more, and the productivity will be better, and you can demand from people, because they sleep. They have 8 hours of continuous sleep. Let's say, food is good, there is personal hygiene, the cabin is in order, and so on. However, a 12-hour shift means a longer stay in the standing position, and often in the not most health-friendly conditions. And then there may be questions from doctors already. How does this work schedule with 12-hour shifts affect the health of the crew? Most of all, a prolonged static stress in a required position influences the health. So that's what Dobroflot's managers have to keep in mind all the time, being between Sila of workflow processes and Charybdis of workers' health. After all, people are a resource for the company no less valuable than unique vessels. Of course, it would be possible to adopt the shift schedule adopted in the military fleet at the time of Peter I. The shifts still have a duration of 4 hours, and breaks between them are 8 hours long. Undoubtedly, there are also so-called extra shift duties for military seamen, but on the whole, this schedule seems more convenient. However, in order to make the work in 3 shifts possible, it would be necessary to increase the number of workers by 1.5 times. And this is not in any way applicable to the size of even such a huge factory ship as Vsevolod-Sibirtsev, nor to the parameters of the business plan. However, the sailors knew what they signed up for. Of course, if the person can't take it anymore, can't get used to the sway, to the conditions on board, there are such cases. We can send the person, if they want it, to shore without any problems. Often, the only incentive to adapt is the financial one. Natalia, for example, doesn't even bother herself with comparing salaries at sea and on shore. She understands that you cannot earn for your own accommodation on shore.
You work on the shore, you still spend that money, right? And let's say there's no opportunity to save up some money, for example, to have your own plans, some goals, and when you are in the sea, you return from the expedition and you get all your earnings.
But you've still got to work to get all your earnings. That is, to work till the end of the expedition. And it's not so easy, even for those who understand what they got into. Even for them, the schedule is sometimes unbearable. However, it's not that easy to decide on the early termination of the contract. Not only will you not get your full salary, you will also experience some financial losses. Work at the floating base never stops. If there are no raw materials, there is an overload of supply or finished products. Vsevolod has already left the territorial waters and is now in the exclusively economic zone of Russia. Now nothing prevents the overload of supplies, and one of the ships that provide the connection of the expedition with the shore, Garbonia, gives the cargo not only to the shipping base, but also to fishing vessels. In order to capture 3 time zones at once, it is not necessary to get to a low Earth orbit. You just need to find the moment when the supply from the carry-away ship, here it is, Garbonia, is in the middle, is being unloaded both onto the floating base and a fishing ship. Garbonia's time is set as in Vladivostok. It corresponds to the home port and the location of the company's head office. Therefore, it's 13:30 now on the ship. The fishing ship has the time zone of the region where it operates. So now it's 2 hours later on it, 15:30. Well, and the floating base is between those 2 time zones. Therefore, here the ship's clock is set in accordance with the time zone, which is called UTC plus 11. That is 11 hours ahead of Greenwich, and 8 more than in Moscow. As the head of the production promised, the unloading was quick. And just in a day, Garbonia is filling cargo hatches to set to the return course towards Nakhodka, leaving Vsevolod behind. This huge factory ship, a part of the rich Soviet legacy. Not all such vessels have found a place in the recent history of the Russian fleet. It would have been just easier to declare fish processing factory ships a Soviet relic, turn a couple of them into museums and junk the rest. But these vessels are also jobs, that is, life for many hundreds and thousands of people who have chosen such work for themselves. A job that is very difficult to separate from life itself. But still, I couldn't help but ask our heroes, where is real life for them? At sea or on shore? Real life. Let's say the ship is the second home, of course. Family is the first home, ship is the second.
Of course, on the shore. I just work here. I make money, and that's it.
Definitely in the sea. I've been a captain for 30 years. There aren't many vacations. Life is like that, just a few vacations. So I'm at sea. Real life is on shore. Here it is work. Of course, on shore, no doubt. Family is waiting, relatives, and my grandchildren. So, life is better on shore. I think at sea. Firstly, I personally know everything at sea. At sea, there are no questions from which it would be necessary. Problems from which it would be necessary to escape, hide, flee somehow. There are no such things at sea. Real life is, of course, on shore. Here, it's kind of work. There is nostalgia, a wish to return if there's been a long period, like 3 to 4 months. It's time to work, catch fish. Of course, the sea is exciting. First, it is the very process. Yes, it is very difficult at sea. But to be honest, sometimes there is no time to sleep. But days go by very quickly. It's real everywhere, both here and on shore. So there will be another day, and it will be January 1st. They will celebrate modestly, and already at 10 minutes after midnight, Roman will take his place at the crane, Natalia at the conveyors. Yuri Vasilievich will supervise so that the production goes without failures. Vladimir Petrovich Slizov will confirm the navigation course to Nakhodka, and Valery Mikhailovich Voloshin will take farewell of his colleague with a lingering signal. Sergei Bova will give an order to set the trawler controlled by Igor Valiev, and all of them will wait for the most important holiday for sailors, the day of their return to home. Then again, they'll go to the sea.